Yeah, you just accept that notification got.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
I'll just check if we are audible to people. Yeah, perfect. We are live. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Caravan. My name is Ishan Sharma, and you are watching Caravan special conversation for a change, not a lecture, but a conversation. And I think I was waiting for this conversation for a very long time, and I'm very happy that it is finally happening. I am very excited and nervous at the same time because today I have this great honor of hosting one of the most renowned names of ancient Indian history and historiography, Professor Patrick Olivelle. Thank you so much, Professor Olivelle, for joining us this evening. Though he doesn't need an introduction, but it's the procedure of, of our event that we read out the introduction. So Professor Patrick Olivelle studied Sanskrit and Indian religion for his BA at Oxford University, which he finished in 1972. In 74, he received a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania for a thesis containing the critical edition of the translation of Yadava Prakasa's Yatidharmaprakasa. From 1974 to 91, Professor Olivelle taught in the Department of Religious Studies at the Indiana University, Bloomington, where he was the department chair from 84 to 90. From 94 to his retirement in 2007, he served as the chair of the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, where he's currently Professor Emeritus. 2020, he was selected as the member of American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And since 75, he has also received various fellowships from various institutions from all across the world, including the National Endowment of the Humanities, Wolfson College, University of Oxford, American Institute of Indian Studies, Smithsonian Institute, and so many more, Guggenheim Foundation, of course. And he has worked on uh, a large array of themes and large uh, maybe well, let's say various themes of Indian history that I think are very fascinating, including Dharam Sutras, Dharam Shastras, and also the Manusmriti law codes of Manu. Today in this conversation, we'll talk about his journey and some important aspects of his research. So over to you, Professor Olivelle. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this, and let's start with the conversation from there.
Thank you very much, Ishan, and welcome to everybody whom I don't see somewhere out in the cyberspace. I will be brief today and later on take some questions from Ishan and others. I've been now working in the area of ancient Indian history of one type or another for a little over 50 years. So it's been a long journey. And I like to tell, especially my students, that my journey over the years, from 1969, when I first started, has been one of unlearning as much as of learning. In other words, there is so much that we have learned or we have been taught to accept that often, especially as historians, we tend to take it for granted. So there are the taken for granted assumptions, presuppositions that we rarely, if ever, question. And this is, I think, one of the major drawbacks in our field. You see it also in the hard sciences. I was alive when they first proposed a theory that the Earth's crust was made up of layers, right? And they were constantly banging against each other which gave rise to earthquakes and volcanoes and things like that. This was ridiculed when it was first proposed by the scientific establishment, right? Something that is now taken for granted. So you find that also much more in the soft sciences like history, because we don't have experimental sciences, we don't have the kinds of truth making that you find in other kinds of hard sciences. So we take for granted the things that was at one time proposed by somebody, right? So I think the central task of scholarship in general, and of history in particular, is to make the familiar unfamiliar. To make the familiar unfamiliar. Someone once said to me, and here I quote, this is like a proverb, in life, familiarity breeds contempt, as we have been told. In scholarship, familiarity breeds acceptance. It is so familiar that you take it for granted as truth. So I want today to bring a few examples of these familiar things that I have found to be wrong, or at least to be not as clear-cut, or needing nuances and some kind of explanation than we have been used to. Let's take the first slide, for example. If you could put it up, Ishan. That's right. Okay. So I wonder, and I wish I had all the people here that I could ask. This is a statement about ancient Indian society in a very, very well-known and a very good book by my good friend, Gavin Flood, who teaches at the University of Oxford. And this kind of statement you find in many introductions to ancient Indian society, right? It says, without any qualification, that Vedic society was divided into 4 classes, that is the 4 varnas: the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the Shudras. And he goes on to say, the top 3 classes, meaning the Brahmins, Kshatriya, and Vaishya, being called the twice-born or Dvija, because boys underwent an initiation, Upanayana. Okay. I want all of you to look at this and see whether you see any problems here with this statement. Let's take the second slide. Now, this is taken from another very famous book by A.L. Basham, The Wonder That Was India, that was written in the 1950s, has been a bestseller from then on, a very, very fine piece of work on ancient India by a very well-known scholar, A.L. Basham, who was the teacher, the professor of Romila Thapar, who was a famous Indian historian of ancient India. And Professor Basham goes on to say a sharp distinction was made between the 3 higher classes and the Shudra. The former were twice born, Dvija, once at their natural birth and again at their initiation, when they were invested with the sacred thread and received into the Aryan society. Now, I want you all to take a look at this and see whether there are problems here from a historical point of view. Is this statement historically accurate? So 2 major statements are made here. One is that the ancient Indian society was divided into 4 classes, social groups, known as Varna. Right? And second, that within this Varna system, there was a further classification into a Dvija and non-Dvija classes. The Shudras, or the people who are not at the top 3 being there. So what I have found, I need to get rid of this. Can I would like to go to my, can I stop this screen? Okay, that's better. Thank you. Okay, so let's take Varna, for example. The question I'm going to ask is, we have been so used to thinking of ancient India in terms of Varna ideology, which later on becomes the caste ideology, right? And I'm not arguing here like some people tend to do, that there was no caste in India, or okay, that's fine, or that Varna didn't exist. What
So
I'm asking
you
is,
could minimize the Zoom.
if you can minimize it, that'd be great. Yes, thank you.
I think you'll have to do it from your computer.
From
It's
my view options, okay.
you just click the escape button on the keyboard.
Oh, okay.
I think that would help you.
Okay, good. I got it. Fine. So the question we need to ask is, who told us that there are 4 Varnas in ancient India? What are the sources for this statement that Gavin Flood has made and others make, right? Flood's statement appears to make a historical and sociological statement. But all of the sources from which we get this information were manufactured and created by Brahmins, by a Brahminical system. So in a sense, when a group of people tell me that this society is divided this way, and we, the people who are talking, are at the top, I always take that with a grain of salt, right? Can we go behind these presentations of the Brahminical text to find out, are there other sources from which we can get maybe a different view of what ancient India was, right? Now, that is somewhat difficult, because we don't find most of the ancient Indian texts were composed by Brahmins, who were the intellectual class, right? So whether it's the Vedic text or the Upanishads or the Dharma Sutras or Manu, all these things are produced by a particular. I'm not trying to say that the Brahmin class of ancient India was monolithic. No, they were not. I'm fully aware of it. There were different voices, different kinds of emphases of this, but still they are from that period. There's one group of texts, though. I'm not talking about the Buddhist, that's also engine. They are rather late, and they have been influenced very much by the Brahminical in a sense of a response. So there's a dialogue there. The group of texts that we have that is independent of this are the Ashokan inscriptions, which were produced over a period of about 25 years in the second half of the 3rd century before the Common Era. Now, when we look at Ashokan inscriptions, the very word Varna is completely absent. The word Kshatriya and Vaishya are absent. Brahman is found, but only as a religious group that is opposed to or in as a dual category. They call it Shramana Brahmana, the Shramanas being the Buddhist monks and giants and the Brahmins. So you find that if Varna was such a central way people identified themselves in ancient India, in other words, if you were living in 2nd century before Christ, would you, when somebody asks, who are you? say I'm a Brahmin, or I'm a Kshatriya, I'm a Vaishya? Is that a self-identification? If it was there, then why didn't Ashoka mention that? Especially because, as I'm writing a book on Ashoka right now, as you will see there, when that comes out next year, is that his definition of dharma is very much relational. There's a self in relationship to a large group of people to whom you have to be ethically responsible connections, right? He talks about slaves, talks about servants, he talks about friends, he talks about teachers, he talks about Brahmins, he talks about Shramanas or ascetics, but nothing about a Shudra, nothing about a Kshatriya, nothing in terms of a Varna. So at least we have to, so if I were writing that particular piece that you saw a minute ago, right, Cabin Floods, if I were writing that, I would say, put an initial phrase, according to Brahmanical descriptions of society, the ancient society was divided into, right? Then you have made a qualification that these are the sources that tell us this is how it was. We do not know what it was like. A second text that is probably Brahmanical, but devoid of Brahmanical ideology, not devoid, but has a much lesser degree, is Kautilya's Arthashastra, which I translated about 5 or 6 years ago. Right? In that, especially if you go to the earlier sections of that, Varna plays a very minor role, if any. Right? Shudras are called Aryas, which the Brahmanical text never do. And Shudras are very much are there, but they are much, if I have to call Shudras in Kautilya Arthashastra, they are cultivators, agriculturalists, farmers, people who work the land. So you have a problem there. Then we get to the second one, which was twice born. People writing about Varna, just like Basham we saw a minute ago, thought that the Divija concept, the concept of a twice born, was always present in India. It was part of the fabric of Varna ideology. But quite by accident, I discovered about, maybe 7, 8, 10 years ago, that that was not the case. The very word Dvija doesn't exist in any of the early Sanskrit texts, not in any of the Vedic texts, Upanishads, Shrauta Sutras, Grihya Sutras, none. Even in the oldest, oh, you got that, okay. Even in the oldest Dharma Sutras, which is that of Apastamba, the word doesn't exist. It makes it entry for the first time, and this is interesting because we can actually tell when it happened. It happened with the composition of the Dharma Sutra of Gautama, which I place around late 2nd century or early 1st century, around that time, before the Common Era. So something happened during this period that made it important for scholars, people who are writing Dharma texts, to make a distinction between the upper classes and the lower classes, and brought the upper classes into a single unit, not just Brahmin and non-Brahmin, but Dvija and non-Dvija. A very interesting division here. And again, we do not know how this was internalized. Were there people in India who went about calling themselves twice born? Or was this a sort of a scholarly classification that remained a scholarly classification that only later became absorbed into the normal normal discourse of the people. And if you look into the next one, you can see this in the Dharma Shastras, the numbers there become much larger as we go down. And then if you go into the epics, the next one, if you put in the epics, you can see the numbers there, huge numbers in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, where there was nothing in the earlier period. So you find that this becomes an increasingly important concept for a Brahmanical thinking, right? For historians, then you need to ask a question: what was happening in India around the 2nd century, late 2nd century, early 1st century before Christ? This is the period soon after the Ashokan reforms. Ashoka had died towards the end of the 3rd century. Right? A Maurya Empire has collapsed. There were invasions from the west, from the Shakas, and later on the Kushanas coming here. So this is the period when India was somewhat of from a political point of view, in turmoil. And Professor Bronkhorst, do you all know of Professor Bronkhorst, who has written this famous book? If you can see this, do you see it? Great Magadha, and who has talked about the Brahmins at this time being in great dire straits. So, all right. So I'm now half an hour gone. So we have talked about the Divija concept and the Varna concept. The third thing I want to talk about is that of Grihastha. Maybe the next. Again, go to the next one. Yeah, due to maybe the one before that. One before that. Yeah, that's good. Okay. So, as you all may know, the term Grihastha literally means staying at home, is the most common term to indicate a Brahmanical householder, person who is married, has a wife and children, lives at home, economically productive, sexually active person, a normal person. And this Grihastha is taken into another Brahmanical classification called the ashramas, the 4 ashramas that parallel the 4 varnas in Brahmanical ideology. And Grihastha there is opposed especially to individuals who have gone away from home. The pravrajita, in Sanskrit, pravraj is to go forth, go away. So going away from home into a homeless, itinerant state, outside of society, people who are ascetics, who are sexually inactive, they are celibates, who are economically unproductive, they don't create wealth, who are dependent on society for their sustenance. They are beggars. They call it bhikshu, right? So in my last 50 years, the first 20 years of my life, 25 years, was taken up by looking at Indian ascetics. I've written books on that. My dissertation was on that, Indian asceticism, which I'll call the Pravrajita. The reason being, we all thought that Grihastha, the householder, there's nothing to talk about there. I mean, it's found everywhere in the world, whether you're a Chinese or a Japanese or an Englishman, they still do similar things, right? Get married, stay at home, have children, etc., etc. So this is not something that a scholar like me should inquire about. But ascetics was something quite new and quite different. So you want to talk about how did that happen? Where did it happen? What were the reasons, etc., right? That we've talked about. It was just a few years ago. We were writing a book, editing a book about the Dharma Shastras, with about 25 scholars contributing. And it was this, if you could see it. Can you see it? Yeah. This is published by Oxford University Press, available in India, by me and Professor Donald Davies. And my good friend, who is a great Vedic scholar, who translated the Rig Veda recently, Professor Stephanie Jameson, was tasked by us to write about the householder in Dharma Shastras. So she, being a very much of a philologist, said, okay, let me go and find all the places that the word grahastha occurs. Right? So she went and tried to find it. And it was not there. And it was not there just like Dvija, that I had worked a little earlier. So the word grahastha is not found in any of the early literature prior to the Dharma Shastras. So then she began to ask, why is this? Why is this new word coming into the vocabulary at this particular time? Because in the Vedic period, the householder or the house lord is called Grihapati, the lord of the house. And that almost disappears from the Brahmanical vocabulary of later times, supplanted by grahastha. So this is where she found, and then we go back to the slide that you have here, that even though grahastha is not found in the Sanskrit literature, it is actually found in the Prakrit literature, especially the Prakrit literature that you find, Prakrit texts that you find in the Ashokan inscriptions. Ashoka refers to grahastha several times, and I'm giving you a few over here. And he's always opposed to the Pravrajita. So in Ashoka's, and I'll be brief here, in Ashoka's usage of the term grahastha, he uses it at once as an opposition to Pravrajita, and also connects both of these to a term that he uses, which is found in later Sanskrit literature, but I think is used, one of the earliest usages is in Ashoka, is called Pashanda. Pashanda in Ashoka, later times Pashanda is viewed as pejorative. It's these other guys are Pashandas, right? Often it is translated as heretical sects. In Ashoka's usage of the term, it is viewed as a religious text, religious group, a demographically identifiable religious group. That's what Pashanda is. And that is, I think, quite interesting, that a Pashanda is made up of, and I think it's made up of, two classes of members, where the Pravrajitas, the ascetics, and people who stay at home. So grahastha is not your later counterpart of Grihapati, but actually holy people, people who are dedicated to a holy life, to a religious life, just like the ascetic, except that they do that at home rather than going away. So this is a very interesting. So after writing this book that I just showed you, I had to go back and rethink what I had earlier written about in terms of the ashrama. You probably know that I wrote a monograph on the ashramas in 1993, right? So quite a while back. At which time I had no idea about what this grahastha thing was. I had taken for granted. This is the I said the familiarity breeding acceptance. I just accepted the fact that Grahastha was just a Brahminical household. Right? Now, after Professor Jamison's work, I found that is no longer true. So you had to rethink this whole thing about what are the ashramas, how did it come about, and when did it come about? Actually, now I have revised my dating of the ashramas from earlier I had said around the 4th century before Christ to probably around the 3rd century or very late in the 3rd century. So around the time of Ashoka or a little even after, around that time. So you can, it's how words, when properly analyzed and put in historical context, can give you great insight into the history that is not available otherwise. And I will end with three you can go down further, I think, Ishan, further down. These are, I should have, yeah, okay, that's good. Yeah, thank you. And there are 3 concepts that every person dealing with India is very, very familiar. The concept of moksha or liberation, right? Concept of rebirth. Connected to that is the concept of samsara. And the concept of karma, which is that what you do, good and bad in this life, you will have rewards or punishments in the next. Put simply, okay, a lot more complex than that, right? Professor Bronkhorst, in that book, Greater Magadha, that I just showed you, brings the thesis that these concepts, especially karma and rebirth, were defining characteristics of a particular local culture, which he calls the culture of Magadha. Magadha today is what is broadly Greater Bihar, right? Centered on Patna, which in the ancient times was Pataliputra. It could have extended a little to the west, little to the east, where Bangladesh, West Bengal is, in that broad area. So he's trying to assert that these very new concepts, and everybody knows that this was new concept. These terms are not found in the Vedic texts. Vedic texts are ignorant of rebirth or karma or moksha. So he's trying to, and a very, very important thesis is geographically, not only temporarily locate in time, but also in terms of geography. Because we know in history doesn't happen exactly at the same time everywhere in a large country like India. So he's trying to say this new thing happened in a particular area of India, which is Magadha, and from there spread to the rest of India, right? The very, very bold claim, which I think is broadly right. I'm not trying to question that. He's probably broadly right. The issue, however, is, and this is where things become more complex, these 3 concepts, rebirth, karma, and moksha, are totally absent in the corpus of Ashokan inscriptions. The issue for the historian is why? If you're talking about Magadha, Ashoka was the king of Magadha. He was right in the heart of Magadha kingdom, right? So a person who was brought up in this culture, a culture that Professor Bronkhorst says the 3 distinct characteristics are these. How did he choose to ignore? The question is, either he ignored it or was ignorant of it, right? Those are the 2 possibilities. He knew it, but didn't think it worthwhile writing about it, or didn't think it was advantageous, for him to write about it, or he didn't know about it. It's difficult to understand why he would be ignorant of it, because he claims that he is a Buddhist. And these three concepts are central to Buddhism as we know it. So if he was ignorant of it, we have to go a step further and make an even bolder statement saying that early Buddhism didn't know about these three concepts. Can that hold water? I think not. I think not. The other possibility is that these concepts were talked about in theological circles among monks, and lay people didn't really pay any attention to it or were not taught that. That's also a little difficult to swallow, that thing, because Ashoka, in his Bhairath edict, is very clear. He tells monks what Buddhist texts to read. He gives them like a reading list, right? If you want to read a good Buddhist text, read these things, right? So he was well aware of the Buddhist, and he says there, everything the Buddha has said is well said. But he says, there are a few that I think are really important, and these are the ones. So it is very clear that it is unlikely, we can never discount the possibility, but it is unlikely that he was ignorant of it, which means he ignored it. If he ignored it, we could ask why. And with that, this last point I will end. If he ignored it, we may ask why. One possibility is that his inscriptions were dealing with other stuff, and this was not something that he needed to deal with. Possible. Unlikely, though, because he talks so much about doing good and avoiding evil, and how doing good will take you to heaven, and doing bad will not take you to heaven, into a bad place. He deals with importance of being good. The word he uses is dharma, to keep to dharma. In that context, karma especially would have been such a fine idea to present to the people, to saying, hey guys, if you are bad, this is what has happened to you. You'll be born as a worm, or as a dog, or something like that, right? A very powerful imagery there. Why didn't he use that imagery? So that is the issue, I think, that we have. I don't have a solution to that, right? But historians need to question that. So, but one thing we can say for sure, is that these three concepts were not prevalent throughout India during the time of Ashoka. If it was, it would have been easy for him to say. My tentative solution is that Ashoka thought that these were local cultural concepts of Magadha. And if he wants to address a wider audience, after all, he was addressing even his Greek audience up in the northwest, what is today Afghanistan, right? He wrote to them also. If he was doing that, he can't be using these local things, right? Which nobody would understand. If that was the case, then these concepts were not widely circulated among Indians. So with that, I will stop and get your questions. The final point is that in all these, you will see that for me, it has been a process of unlearning and learning. And that has been what kept me going. Yeah, here we go.
Thank you so much, Professor Olivelle, for that wonderful, slideshow and your presentation. And that I was just thinking throughout that I think that's the quality of a historian, that one must keep questioning and critically analyzing, and also maybe changing their own presumptions about the past. As you said that when you were writing about that monologue on the ashrama dharma, you had very little or no idea about the importance of the Grihastha ashrama, or what it meant, or was it ever mentioned in any of the text. But later, when you edited it, you clarified, you corrected your own misinformation in the edited volume. And I think that's the unlearning that we were talking about, and it's an important aspect of a historian's journey, that they keep learning from new researches that come to the flow. And I think that's something that we all must learn from you and other historians of our of our discipline. But let's I think those who are watching us, we have many people who are watching us right now. I can see on my phone. So, people, you could just send me your questions on the live chat. I'll read them out to Professor Olivelle, and he'll be happy to answer your questions. But my question to you, let's because we were saying that we'll make it some little autobiographical, this conversation. So I wanted to know, because you were born in Sri Lanka, and one would assume that in Sri Lanka, the history would focus on the Pali text or the Buddhist history. But how did you get into Hinduism, history of Hinduism, and Dharmasastra and Dharma Sutras?
Yeah. um, Life is a series of accidents. Life is not a planned journey, right? When you are born, you do not know where you're going to go. So it's all of us have that. Some are more planned, better planned than others, but all have accidental twists and turns. Actually, when I came to Oxford, I was going to do Pali. Oxford didn't have a Pali program. Pali was your second language. Sanskrit was always the first language. So I did first language Sanskrit. My second language could be Prakrit, Pali, or Persian, ancient Persian. So I took Pali. So Pali was and my first book actually was my thesis in Oxford, was the origin and early development of Buddhist monarchism. So it was a Buddhist text. I came to the University of Pennsylvania hoping to do Buddhism. But there really was nobody there really doing Buddhism. And the person who was there wanted me also to do Chinese and Tibetan if I wanted to do Buddhism, which I think is right. But at that stage in my life, I was not going to take up another two difficult languages. So I stuck to Sanskrit. And there was this great teacher that I had there, Professor Ludo Rocher, who was a great Dharmashastric scholar. And I worked under him to do his PhD. The rest is history. Talking about history, yeah. Right. So, yeah, so that was my turn to a different area, different path. And I think it has been productive. And I think I became a more productive scholar, a better scholar in this area than I probably would have been doing Buddhism.
Yeah, a question that often people ask us is how to choose a theme for their PhD, for their thesis. How did you navigate through that?
Yeah, so I always tell my students two things. Students think that your dissertation is your life's work. It is not your life's work. It is the beginning of your life's work. A PhD, what a PhD gives you is a credentials. You have been credentialed to have done sufficiently good work, original work, so that a university could say, this person deserves the PhD degree. Your real work begins afterwards, not before. Most students doing a PhD are too immature to do really top-level scholarship. They're just beginning the craft, right? They're beginning the craft. So what you need to think about when you are doing a PhD dissertation is to select a topic that you are interested in. You don't want an area that you have no interest in, right? Second, everything that interests you may not be viable as a PhD dissertation. Do you like it? Is it doable? This is where your teachers come in. teachers came and said, yes, that's possible. Somebody would say, that's too broad. You can't write, for example, a dissertation on the history of India, right? That's impossible. You have to select doable, and third, doable within a particular time frame. You can't do your PhD dissertation for 20 years. You have to finish it within a reasonable period of time, 3-5 years, right? So then you have to select it, something that is narrow enough, into which you can go deep, but within a short period of time, you can complete it. So those are the kinds of criteria you need to have for doing that. But always remember, this is not going to be the best work you will do in your life. This is the work that you need to get credentials. It is like getting a driver's license. You will not be a Grand Prix driver when you get your driver's license. Tells you are good enough to drive, and then you can become a racing driver or whatever you want to be, right? Or a bus driver or whatever. So I think so you need to keep your ambitions within control, right? What you don't want to do is to finish 3-4 years of your PhD and still have nothing to show for it, except reading a lot, knowing a lot, thinking about a lot, liking all of it, but nothing to show for it.
There is a comment for you by somebody called Sio Melono. He says, thank you, sir. On your concluding point on karma, moksha, just a submission, is it possible that the conceptualization of these terms was not yet fully developed for you to suggest quote unquote local thing? So that's his suggestion, that there was no conceptualization of those terms as yet.
Yeah. So now all of that is possible. Conceptualization also, you can't think of conceptualization as a general concept across India in the vast geography. You could talk about conceptualizations within narrower, smaller communities, right? So it could have been developed in one area or within one religious organization, but not in others, right? So you need to be nuanced in that. And the way I think that if you think that at least some of the Buddhist texts, scriptural texts, and Jain texts were composed broadly during this period, right? Then we have quite sophisticated theological arguments with regard to them, right? The whole thing about Buddha's enlightenment and what he got during that time, right? The Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path, the Pratitya Samutpada, all of that, for example, are strong articulations of these kinds of theories. But it could have been in a smaller segment of the sects and religions that existed at this time. This period, that is what I call the most seminal period of Indian history, is between what I have called, I've edited one book called Between the Empires, between the Maurya Empire and the Gupta Empire. That's the most seminal period of Indian history, right? During this seminal period, there were so many competing philosophies, ideologies, theologies, religions, religious lives. So it is possible that in some of these terms, these concepts got better articulation, better refinement than in others. But it is very clear that they were not the kind of general concepts that you find in later India, because in later India, you could go anywhere and talk about karma and people will understand what they are talking about, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for that answer. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining in. It's about an hour and we have to ask some questions off record to Professor Olivelle that you'll see later on our YouTube channel. Small clippings of those questions. So do check those out. It was truly an honor hosting Professor Olivelle on Caravan. Thank you so much, sir, for being here on
You're
live.
welcome.
And there are many, many questions coming up, but I'll compile them and send it to you later. Maybe I think that's, and you can write the answers to them later. So people who are sending questions right now, we request you to send those to our email address at karwanheritage@gmail.com. Very easy. KARWAANHERITAGE @gmail.com. And we'll share those emails with Professor Olivelle, and he'll get back to you there. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll end the live now because we have to record something, but that you'll see very soon on Caravan.